Welcome back, everyone, to a new reaction series. We're ready to dive into some more extra history. This is one that came out a little while ago, and I've had a lot of requests for it. Wanted to give it some time. This is Henry Ford. It's a 5-part series. So we'll do 2, and 1 as far as how we do it. I'll do the first 2 episodes today. We'll do 3 and 4 tomorrow, and then the 5th episode the day after that. And as always, for those of you who are patrons and members, you will get to see the next part of the series a day in advance. I'm recording all of these in advance before I head to the UK next week, so I'll have plenty of content to keep you going while I'm gone, and looking forward to meeting a bunch of you over there in London and in Birmingham at our meetups. So let's go ahead and dive into part 1, The Boy Who Hated Horses.
1896, Edison Company Annual Conference, Coney Island, New York. The electricity men sit around the table, talking about transportation. This engineer, teases one Edison employee, has built a quadricycle run by gasoline. Everyone then turns toward that young engineer, including the man at the head of the table, Thomas Edison. Is it a 4-stage combustion? Asks Edison. The engineer, a young Henry Ford, breaks into a sweat. He's extremely nervous, and rightfully so. After all, Edison is an electricity man, and likely favors electric vehicles. But still, Ford gets up and presents to Edison, sketching out his engine while explaining the combustion process. How gas is an improvement over electricity because batteries are far too heavy and drain in cold weather. Then suddenly, mid-conversation, the old man rises and slams his hands down on the table. You've done it! He's just convinced Edison that the future will be gasoline-powered. And it is Henry Ford who will assemble that future at the rate of 1 car every 93 minutes.
So what's crazy about this time in history is there's so much going on with so many different areas. Obviously the oil industry is kind of started booming in places like Northeast Ohio here, where John D. Rockefeller is one of the first big magnates of it. You've got the steel industry, and you've got these what we call robber barons, these men who are going to make tons of money and become the world's first billionaires. And they all know each other, and they're all competing against each other. And Westinghouse and Edison with electricity, and Tesla's involved in that. And so all of the stuff that we take for granted that is such a huge part of our lives today. Things made out of steel, tall buildings, electricity, combustion engines. All of it is getting its start at this time, and it's just crazy to see how these guys all cross paths with each other.
Thanks so much to Henson Shaving for modernizing how I keep my face smooth. Here's an eye-opening thought. Henry Ford was born just after the Battle of Gettysburg and lived to see the beginning of the Cold War. Of course, in that span of time, the world changed in almost unbelievable ways, often as a result of his own innovations, and not always for the better, as we'll discuss in future episodes.
It's so crazy when you think about how much technology changed in that time, and you think about how much people saw in that time. Yeah, there were Civil War veterans, men who fought in the Civil War, who lived to see the atomic bomb and to see jet engines. Just think about a person who was born in 1860, around the time that Henry Ford was, what they saw in their lifetimes, the telephone, airplanes, even rockets that would go into space in some cases, these people saw, television, radio, all of it.
Later in life, Ford would become almost painfully nostalgic for the era of his childhood and spend millions building open-air museums of its buildings and artifacts, among which is an unassuming farmhouse, painstakingly furnished to the smallest detail, even with the drawers curated so they contained the precise objects he remembered in them. It was the house of his childhood. And despite this aforementioned nostalgia, also a house he had hated. Henry Ford's father had fled Ireland during the Great Famine and settled on a farm in Dearborn, Michigan. His mother was a second-generation immigrant from Belgium, raised by Irish neighbors when she was orphaned. And despite his parents' hardscrabble stories, they'd become successful and prosperous farmers. So, though not wealthy, young Henry Ford was never truly poor. There was always enough work to go around, which actually turned out to be a problem for young Henry because, man, he hated farm work. It was repetitive, physically taxing, and isolating. He despised...
Interesting that he hated something that was repetitive, because he's going to be one of the pioneers of repetitive work with the assembly line.
Horses, calling them dangerous and ill-tempered, and found drinking milk repulsive. He even considered chicken meat unfit for human consumption. Not to mention, young Ford was infamous for shirking his farm duties. About an hour into each day's work, Henry would usually go back to the house for a drink of water and then disappear. They'd find him later taking apart someone's watch. Now, most farmers of the time would have punished this behavior, but Ford's parents, his mother especially, indulged him. They set up a workbench where Ford could tinker and bought him tools. Still, his father's expectation that Ford one day would take over the farm strained their relationship.
Listen, every parent is different, and I by no means claim to be any kind of an expert when it comes to parenting. But from my own experience, both with my own parents who raised me and now as a parent myself, parents, there are a few things you can do that will benefit your child, like embracing what they love, as long as it's something that's healthy and not inappropriate. When I was a kid and I first fell in love with history, my grandparents who raised me, they were my parents, they embraced it. They planned our family trips to battlefields. They bought me books and videos for Christmas that were about history. They bought me games that were about history. They did everything they could. When they saw that that was something I was passionate about, they embraced it. And I try to do the same thing with my kids. If, my son Eli came to me a couple of months ago and said, "Hey, I'd like to try basketball." He's 11 years old. He'd never, to my knowledge, tried basketball in his life, but he was interested and he was excited for it. And I'm like, okay, sure, we'll sign him up. And kid's not too bad for having never played it before. And he's loving it. And an hour before we leave for the game, I can just see him bouncing off the walls because he's so excited. And you know what? Embrace it yourself. Learn things. Like my son started getting interested in space, and so we got a telescope and started doing astrophotography. And it's fun. It's not something I ever would have done on my own, but it's time for me and my kid together, and it's something he loves, and it's created in him an interest. So I give Henry Ford's parents a lot of credit for embracing this part of him, and obviously it shaped him into who he became.
Especially after Ford's beloved mother died when he was 13. That was one of two big changes that happened in Ford's early life. The other, when he first saw the engine. Fall 1875. Henry was helping his father bring in the harvest when they see it coming down the road atop four wheels. A portable traction engine, meant to be hooked up to threshing machines or sawmills to power them. And in a clever innovation, the machine is self-propelled. There are chains leading from the engine to the cart's rear wheels, so when the motor runs, the cart rolls slowly along the dirt road. Ford immediately stops the engineer and bombards him with questions. Who makes the machine? How fast can it go? How big is the boiler? Henry is 12, and he's just glimpsed a future where not only the tedium of farm labor can be eased, but where he can leave this farm behind on motor-driven wheels. That moment never left him. 4 years later, at 16, he convinced his father to let him move to Detroit to find an engineering job. In an act just pregnant with meaning, the man who would help revolutionize American transportation actually had no choice but to walk the 9 miles to the city. Detroit was another world when compared to his farm, one where there was plenty of work for a wannabe machinist, especially one like Ford, who was socially adept, confident, and willing to exaggerate his experience a bit.
Of course.
For the next decade, Ford worked a string of jobs, building his knowledge base and his reputation as a skilled machinist. He sought out roles.
And this is just a great reminder that nobody becomes who they are in a vacuum. There are always people who help us along the way. I don't know the name of the person who taught Henry Ford these skills, but I guarantee that without him, we never hear about Henry Ford, because he poured into Henry Ford his knowledge, his experience, his training that led Ford to then be able to go the next step. A while back, my friend Mr. Beat did a video on what it means to be self-made. And while hard work and knowledge and talent will get you really far, we all need help from other people along the way.
Where he could learn and experiment. Those that had stores of older equipment he could try out and examine, or that included large amounts of downtime where he could mess around with the parts he occasionally pilfered from his workplace. And apart from a basic business course, this was Ford's education. His formal schooling had stopped at 8th grade and contained little that would prepare him for an industrial career. Though that doesn't mean it didn't shape him. Back in his school days, Ford's teachers instructed directly from readers, a form of early textbook that taught an uncritical ethos of American progress and capitalist economics that Ford deeply internalized while also containing some pretty blatant anti-Semitism. Wait, did you see that cloaked figure? Oh my gosh, it's the foreshadow! The foreshadow knows. Ford hopped jobs when he'd learned all he could, and his skills progressed quickly. By 19, when he circled back to his family farm to work a Westinghouse steam engine for a season, he was adept enough to get hired by Westinghouse to fix similar machines. And repair was his favorite.
And again, here's how all these paths are crossing: Westinghouse and Edison, and who were kind of enemies of each other, and Ford right there in the middle of it.
Type of job. It used his problem-solving abilities while giving him large blocks of time to tinker. And tinker he did, mostly with motors. He repaired an internal combustion engine, which helped him see the potential of gasoline, and even built a miniature model engine. His greatest accomplishment, though, was convincing a family friend, Clara Bryant, to marry him. She did so with the knowledge that she wouldn't really see him much. He worked 16-hour days, but they matched each other well. She listened when Ford talked about his experiments, and had seemingly endless reserves of patience. Case in point, on Christmas Eve 1893, Clara had her hands full preparing a dinner for guests while also watching their 6-week-old son Edsel. But then in comes Henry, with his new gasoline engine, plopping it on the sink, and asking her to feed it gas as he turned the crank to make it run. Now, Rob, who is married, has some advice. Never do this, particularly when there are knives within easy reach. Clara, however, gamely served as assistant. Just like she put up with the constant house moves, the job changes, and the very strange things going on in the back shed. Thankfully, by 1891, Ford had a steady position at the Edison Illuminating Company of Detroit, repairing the engine that powered much of the city's lighting. That was just for money, though. His experiments were increasingly centered around internal combustion engines, which were sometimes known by the incredibly metal name explosion engines. In 1885, German engineer Gottlieb Daimler had demonstrated how one could power a vehicle, what we would call today a motorcycle. But the field was so new, no one knew what to call anything. In fact, the first ever car race in the United States, held in 1895, also included a contest to name these new vehicles. People called them many things, some still familiar, others strange, ranging from horseless carriage to gasoline wagon to motor carriage, motocycle, or auto carriage. Of course,
motor carriage is one that I think I've heard a lot, as well as horseless carriage.
We know that the French term automobile, meaning self-mobile, ultimately won out, but that took time. And if you'll notice, those names we listed showcase kind of a split. Half of the terms refer to wagons and carriages, where the other half refers to bicycles.
Yeah, you have to understand that the first motivation in making these vehicles isn't to give people a way to get to work or, to travel. It's much more practical than that. It's about how can we make things that make work easier. Tractors for plows, for farms. Engines that help. One of the first steam engines in history was in the Midlands in England, and it was used to pump water at a coal mine. I mean, these were the very practical uses of this stuff. The market for pleasure or leisure or just making life easier from one place to another was really kind of secondary in all this.
Ford's work fell in the later camp. Starting out with the body of a cart or a carriage made it too heavy, he reasoned. Better to upscale a bicycle with its light spoked wheels and rubber tires, then put a carriage seat on it. That's what he did for years in his shed, crafting a vehicle he called the Ford quadricycle, the car he would describe to Thomas Edison. But now, it's June 4th, 1896, and he is done testing. Unable to wait for the seat carriage he ordered to come, Ford decides to take his first drive on the quadricycle at 3 in the morning when the streets will be empty, watched by a bleary-eyed Clara and Edsel. He begins to push it out of the shed, but then suddenly stops. Oh no, there's a variable he never accounted for, despite 2 years of testing. It's too big to fit through the door.
Oh.
Not to worry. Ford hacks through the door frame with an axe, then once freed from the prison shed, he mounts his vehicle, starts the ethanol engine, and puts it into first gear. The cycle begins to move, the 4-horsepower engine speeding him along as he turns off the alley into the street at a sweet 10 miles an hour. A friend rides ahead warning traffic. He shifts into second gear, 20 miles an hour. Henry Ford is driving his first vehicle, but within the year, he'll sell it. because he had a vision of a better model. A car that can not only enter the next great American motor race, but a car that can win it, which would eventually set in motion a level of innovation and precision manufacturing of high-quality products that could be produced on a scale to keep them affordable. And that is a mindset that today's sponsor, Henson Shaving,
So it's funny what motivates in this case, right? It starts out with him just wanting to learn and to know all he can, and then now taking that knowledge and making something practical from it. But it's also motivated by wanting to win a race, which I believe is something we're going to be talking more about. So let's go ahead and dive right into episode 2.
Grosse Pointe Racetrack, October 10th, 1901, 7th lap. Henry Ford is terrified out of his mind. He'd entered his new car into this race to get his name in the newspapers, but not as an obituary. His racer, named Sweepstakes, has a 2-cylinder, 26-horsepower engine clocked at 72 miles an hour with no brakes. Also, he's never driven in a race and has never tried to turn the vehicle at high speed. His mechanic crouches on the running board, ready for breakdowns. Not to mention the track is a horse racing track, with dirt mounted on the curves to prevent cars from flying off. But every time Ford takes the turn, he feels like he's going to ram into the fence. His mechanic has to lean out to keep the car from flipping, and noise from the grandstand washes over them as they whip past. Their opponent, Alexander Winton, is a seasoned race driver. Hours before, he'd just broken the land speed record. Winton is ahead, but Ford is getting used to the curves and catching up. Then Winton's machine starts bleeding blue smoke. Coming around, 8th lap. Ford punches it on the straightaway and passes Winton, whose car is wreathed with cloud as his mechanic pours oil on the overheating engine. Improbably, Ford crosses the finish line and swears never to race again.
Well, it was never about the race. It was about notoriety. It was about, at this point, what you need. If you have knowledge and you have a good idea, very often that's not enough. You need money, you need investors, you need people who believe in you and who give you the capital to make it happen.
Thanks so much to Factor for keeping us well fed on a busy schedule. By the time Henry Ford won the 1901 sweepstakes, Detroit was well on its way to its nickname of Motor City. Car companies were opening everywhere in Detroit, with the same chaotic boomtown feel as the gold rush or oil strikes in Pennsylvania. And ironically, many of the people involved then are still household names today. In Detroit, the man to beat was Ransom E. Olds, whose Oldsmobiles were already in production in 1901. And for potential challengers like Ford, one of the best ways to attract attention and investment were publicity stunts, such as winning races, setting speed records, or driving long distances. Actually, Alex Winton, his opponent in that 1901 race, had won backers for his own car company by driving his show model from Cleveland to New York City. Similarly, Ford's race win secured him financial backing by a group of rich Detroiters he'd been cultivating as potential investors for years. And in 1901, those investors helped him form the Henry Ford Company and started working on a production model single-cylinder car. Or rather, they worked on it. Ford was mostly AWOL. See, he wasn't really interested in making single-cylinder runabouts, a term derived from a type of small carriage, to compete with Oldsmobile. Ford was usually elsewhere designing his next race car. After months of arguments with the investors and a new engineer they brought in, he voluntarily left the company with a $900 buyout.
Jeez. So this is the trick when you need money and you need investors. Those investors, since they're putting their money into it, they want to have a say in it too. And minds like Henry Ford, Thomas Edison's of the world, one of the drawbacks to having all that knowledge and to having developed so much on your own is that, and I know you're going to say Thomas Edison didn't do anything on his own. Nobody did. Henry Ford got a lot of his ideas as well from guys like Benz in Germany, who were pioneers of this stuff. Everybody ever who invented anything built their work and their inventions on the backs of other people who did similar work and pioneered some of those things before them. What I mean by all this is to say you don't like other people crowding your space when it comes to your ideas. And this is probably just a clash of ideas, and their money, they're putting money in not to develop the next great idea, but to make money. So it's a clash of wills and ideas.
This was part of a repeating pattern for Ford, whose resentment for bankers and money men, both air quotes, would only grow. Ooh, there's the foreshadow again.
Yeah.
The Henry Ford Company, no longer having Henry Ford, quietly folded and was never heard from again. No, I'm joking. It just renamed itself Cadillac. Meanwhile, Ford had enough money to support himself plus an idea for a race car that would build on his reputation as a designer of high-performance vehicles. He partnered with 2 professional bicycle racers, the closest thing to seasoned race car drivers at the time, to create the ultimate racing machine. Caring not for aesthetics, they stripped every bit of excess weight off it until it was nothing but a massive engine, a pipe frame, and a steering yoke. Because the car was so wild, the driver needed more leverage than a wheel could provide. They built 2 models, christened Aero and 999, but apart from setting a land speed record in 999 on a frozen lake where it was relatively safe, Ford would not drive either of these 2 wild beasts in a race. They'd hire a driver for that. But after a series of technical setbacks, Ford lost confidence in the machines and bailed once again, taking a buyout. This was a smart move in many ways. See, the cars were so associated with Ford that when 999 won another high-profile race and went on to tour the country, Ford still got the credit as a designer. AKA zero responsibility, but all the glory.
Yep.
And it was off the back of that PR victory that Ford met the Detroit coal delivery entrepreneur Alexander Malcolmson, and the 2 formed a plan to manufacture vehicles. The idea was simple. They wouldn't manufacture a car, they'd assemble it. The parts could come from suppliers who were better at manufacturing the individual components. And the main machinists they relied on were a pair of brothers who Ford worked with briefly at the Henry Ford Company, who had experience supplying Oldsmobile and were, well, a little nuts. They were old-school frontier types, known for saloon brawls and packing revolvers.
So this is a time in history where people are trying to accumulate for themselves all of the means of production and distribution under one banner. You know, guys like Rockefeller, he wants to not only control the oil, but he wants to control it. It's being pumped, it's being refined, it's being transported, it's being sold. He wants all of it. And this is where you start to get the antitrust lawsuits and gobbling up other companies that might be your competitors. But Ford's looking at this differently. Rather than trying to do everything, he's going to do what he does well, which is put it all together in an assembly plant, which is kind of the model that is used to this day. We had a big GM assembly plant for decades, real close to where I lived. They're bringing in the parts from all over the place, places in Mexico and Canada and other parts of the United States, but they're putting them together for the finished product in the assembly plant. And that's what he's going to do, and he's going to do really well.
In fact, once, one brother had an altercation with a bartender that ended with him pointing a gun at the poor guy and making him dance on his own bar top while he smashed up the establishment to the tune of $30,000 of damage. Those brothers were named John and Horace Dodge. On June 16, 1903, Ford, Malcolmson, the Dodge brothers, and several small backers who'd borrowed money from friends and family gathered to form the Ford Motor Company. Ford, with his history of bailing on partners, however, would be vice president and not president this time round. Of course, years later, these men would all be millionaires. But that was in no way certain in June 1903. They had a prototype of their new Model A, and were getting orders, but they were assembling it in a rented wooden factory meant for carriage building. They ran into quality problems with suppliers, and money dwindled. Plus, always preferring to work in 3 dimensions, Ford liked to jump from concept drawings to fabricating parts right away, then make adjustments from there, which is a very expensive way to work. When on July 23rd, the first Model A was delivered to a buyer, the company only had $223 in its bank account. Soon, though, money wouldn't be a problem.
Gotta start selling.
The 1903 Model A was a roaring success. However, sales did lag behind its rival Oldsmobile model, which sold for $150 cheaper.
So, at a time when this is really kind of a luxury and not many people have these, $600 is a lot of money. And that extra $150, especially when nobody knows anything about the product. So it's not like you're like, all right, I'm going to compare how these two operate and then decide maybe the one that's more expensive is worth more. Nobody knows any of that. So you're going to go with what's cheaper because it's already super expensive. So you can already see how Ford's wheels are going to start to turn in his mind about how can we make these less expensive, make them more available to people, but also still turn a profit.
Ford kept tinkering, replacing the A with a modified Model AC with a redesigned engine. The next year, they followed it with the Model B, which put the engine up front rather than under the driver's seat. And by the end of 1904, Ford had moved its operation to a purpose-built brick plant and was the 4th largest car manufacturer in the nation, though still behind Oldsmobile and Cadillac. Ford began to rely less on suppliers, bringing the manufacturing increasingly in-house. But as more and more models of cars claimed their letters of the alphabet, a battle was brewing in the corporate boardroom over the direction of the company.
Of course.
Malcolmson and Ford, who jointly owned a controlling stake, were at odds. Malcolmson wanted to produce high-end cars, like the enormously profitable Model K with its powerful six-cylinder engine, whereas Ford wanted to capture the mid-range market, with cars like the Model N, and eventually begin moving enough product to bring the price down. The head of the company sided with Ford, and they bought out Malcolmson's shares. Then, in a grim happenstance, a few months later, the company president dropped dead of a heart attack, and Ford took over, his power now absolute. He set aside a room with several designers and began to work on a new concept. Ford wanted to create a car for the masses, not one that was as cheap as the $250 runabouts being pumped out by other companies, but a vehicle middle-class families could afford. One that would liberate the American public and end the isolation of the country's rural farmers.
And this is huge because remember, the United States is a pretty big country. Just perspective-wise for our European friends. To drive from one end of Texas to the other, basically if you go Brownsville to say Texline, Texas, you're still in Texas. That's about the distance from Paris to Berlin. And that's the same state. So, the United States is huge, and at this point you have trains to help you to travel, but this is when you're going to start to have national parks developing, and people are going to be starting to be more interested in things like leisure time, and obviously people who are working don't have a lot of time for that because they're working mad hours, but the U.S. is transforming into a nation that is more connected. And by this point, most of the states have become states. There's only a couple of the 48 contiguous states that haven't entered the Union yet as states. So the United States is modernizing.
A car, in short, that families like his could have bought. It would need to be sturdy. Its four-cylinder engine powerful but not overpowering. Easy to drive and relatively attractive with a top speed of 42 miles an hour. And crucially, it should be easy to fix. An owner should be able to repair it themselves with no special training. But as he worked with his draftsmen down on the factory floor, the employees themselves started working on an experiment. See, Oldsmobile had recently sped up production with a concept known as the moving assembly line. An idea that if you hung an engine, for instance, on a moving track, and had each worker do a specific part of the assembly, you could produce cars more efficiently. Ford loved this concept, tinkering with it himself to fine-tune it. And when his newly designed vehicle, the Model T, first crossed the factory floor in 1908, it would do so on hanging tracks and conveyor belts.
So again, they mention how Oldsmobile did this first. Nothing that the people we give credit for do originally came from them. The Wright brothers weren't the first people to mess with airplanes. They get the credit for it because they were the ones who were able to make it successful. And part of it, too, is not just about being first. It's also about how well you can market yourself. That's where Thomas Edison was so good. Thomas Edison wasn't the first guy to make a light bulb. He perfected an incandescent light bulb by making it more marketable and making it more useful. Henry Ford isn't the first guy to develop an automobile. He's not the first guy to develop a combustion engine. He's not the first guy to develop the assembly line, but he's able to take all of that stuff and make it marketable and make it affordable and make it mass producible.
And true to Ford's vision, it would change the world. The Model T was enormously popular, and 15 million of them would come off Ford's assembly lines in the next 19 years. They would be used as tractors and firefighting vehicles, as pleasure cars and workhorses of family transportation. But it would also be used for field ambulances. For as 1914 approached, the world was entering a dark period, and Henry Ford would increasingly descend into darkness as well.
But there is no way I'm going to be able to handle telling you that part of the tale next week while my tummy's rumbling like it is.
So he's going to talk about Factor, which my son's really into Factor meals. They like them a lot. And so I want to encourage you to check out the original content. I put the links in the description for the first episode in this as well. And like I said, for those of you who are members or patrons, later on, after this video goes live, the next episode is going to be available for all of you as well. So check that out. I'll post that on Patreon and here on YouTube for the members. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below, and we'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.